Welcome back, everyone, to the second day of the virtual C4 convention. I am Leanna Spurrier. I am kind of facilitating all of the sessions, and we are here this evening with Jeff Rock talking about British and Irish coppers used in colonial North America. So Jeff Rock is one of the 4 founding members of C4, so I should hope most of you have heard of him before. And he's been collecting colonials since the 70s and a dealer since 1989, and has written for many different publications along the way. So without further ado, I will let you take it away, Jeff, and I will be back for the Q&A at the end.
Great, thank you so much. And thank all of you for watching, because as we know, it is Friday the 13th and it is 2020. So what could possibly go wrong, right? Okay, better times. So I've been asked to give a talk on a subject that most of you have heard of, but which few of you actually collect: the counterfeit British and Irish copper coinage of the 18th century. So let's start with the most obvious question going through most of your minds. Why should a collector of American colonials care about British counterfeits? Yeah. Well, what was the most common copper coin in 18th century North America? Connecticut coppers might be a good guess. There are 365 or so dye varieties known, which speaks of a very large coinage, but they were never the most prevalent coin in circulation in the United States. And they probably weren't even the most prevalent coin in Connecticut in the years that they were being minted. Maybe New Jersey coppers. Millions were authorized, millions were struck, but same thing. They were never the most prevalent copper coin in all of colonial or early North America. The most common copper coin in North American circulation throughout the 18th century, from beginning to end, both as British colonies and in the first decades of the United States, were, drum roll please, counterfeit British and Irish halfpins. Despite that, counterfeits have not been included in major reference works on colonial and early American coinage, though things that never circulated here were welcomed into the same books with open arms. The Summers Island pieces never saw circulation in mainland North America. American plantation tokens, far more have been found in the mud of the Thames River in London than anywhere in North America. All of these other things never came here. No evidence that elephant tokens, Vos Populis, Pitt halfpennies, Rhode Island ship medals, Franklin Press tokens, North Wales halfpennies, or any of these other coins that are somewhat questionable were ever seen in North America until they were brought here by collectors in the 19th century. So doesn't it seem hard to justify including things that were never used here while absolutely ignoring the one thing that was used the most? So let's explore why counterfeits were made in tremendous quantities and why many of them ended up in America. The British Crown never produced enough copper coins to fill the needs of trade in England. The needs of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales were less important, and those of the American colonies were less important still. Part of this was due to the very real disconnect between King, who never used a copper coin in his life, and his subjects, for whom copper was the most important coin that most of them ever saw. Wages for most workers were paid in copper, and prices for food and drink were usually quoted in pence, halfpence, and farthings, not in silver and gold. A skilled day labor would make under 20 pence a day in the late 18th century, the time that interests most of us. A farm laborer maybe around 9 pence a day. A female domestic servant might make just 2 to 3 pounds per year, about 4 pence a day, while a beggar might get a farthing to maybe a couple of pence a day if he was very lucky. Prices of goods, as we can see, were similarly modest. One could get a meal of bread, cheese, and beer for 3 pence. You want some little cold meat added to it, double the cost. You want bread and butter for a week? That would also cost you 3 pence. But when you start factoring things like, rent, clothing, fuel for heating, medicine, candles for lighting at night, and many other expenses, it's easy to see why the poor remained poor, but the ability to numb the pain of life was also quite cheap. Gin could be had at a rate that was advertised as drunk for a penny, dead drunk for tuppence. And here's a 1768 Hogarth engraving of Gin Lane in London, which kind of looks a little bit like a C4 convention to me. The Royal Mint produced silver and gold coin in quantity during the 18th century, but copper was hit or miss. George I issued only a small number in the early 18th century at the exact same time that William Wood was coining halfpence and farthings for England and Ireland, or for Ireland and North America, sorry. George II authorized halfpence and farthings for England and Ireland over the course of 30 years, though not in one of those years were there enough issued to satisfy the demands of commerce. George III issued copper coins in only 6 years of the 1770s for England, and Ireland had just 2 years of copper coins struck in each of the 1760s, 1770s, and 1780s. Easy to see why there wasn't enough in circulation. The shortage of circulating regal copper was filled by counterfeits, which were accepted by the populace. And why this was the case is worth exploring. Regal coppers never contained their full value in copper. So they were something of a token coinage to begin with. And they had an implied value that was significantly above the value of the metal they contained. This was especially true as the price of copper plummeted in the late 18th century. There were vast lodes mined in Cornwall and Anglesey, which drove prices down. Silver and gold coins were highly regulated, and they contained their full value in precious metal when they were struck, less a very small amount to cover the cost of minting. Copper coins never contained their full value in metal, at least until 1797, when Matthew Boulton was striking the Cartmill coinage at the Soho Mint. This meant that while the Royal Mint broke even on silver and gold coinage, it made a profit on every copper coin it struck. Falling copper prices meant more profit. And you would think that this would have encouraged the crown to coin more copper and less silver and gold. But as we know, politics seldom works in ways that make sense. Since people knew that they weren't getting the full amount of copper in each coin, it likely didn't matter much to them if that profit went to the king or to someone else, as long as they actually had coins to use. That margin between face value and actual metal value is what allowed counterfeiters to operate. Counterfeits likely started off fairly good weight, which made a profit, but they soon decreased in size, and the later issues often weighed half or less of the authorized weight of a regal coin. This downward trend in weight is also seen in most of the state coinages in America, where the 1788 dated coins are nearly always lighter than the 1785, 1786 dated issues. A small profit on nearly full weight counterfeits turned into an even larger profit on extremely light ones, provided they could be gotten into circulation at full value. It appears that some counterfeits were sold in bulk at a discount to their implied face value. Some of these might have been sold to merchants who needed them to make change for customers, but most of those bulk sales appear to have been to large businesses, which used them to pay workers. This effectively cut their payroll dramatically in the process. 30% discount seems to be the norm for bulk purchases, which meant that 1,000 counterfeit halfpence could be purchased for the value of 700 regal halfpence. Those 1,000 counterfeits would then be paid out in wages at their full halfpenny value, and it was up to the workers to get them into commerce. In times when coins were in short supply, merchants and others would pretty much have to accept them at full face value. But when there was an abundance of good coins or simply too many bad coins in circulation, merchants might only take them at a steep discount or maybe not at all. This was a harsh reality, but getting paid in mostly counterfeit coppers was still better than the only alternative these workers had, which was for a dozen or more workers to get paid with a single gold coin or a very large piece of paper currency and try to get that changed. There were no banks at the time to do this, and their only option would be to take it to a pub, which meant the purchase of several rounds of drinks, and we know how that likely ends up, whatever small amount of change was left over would still likely have been paid in counterfeit coppers, especially if they were too drunk to notice the difference. Counterfeiting was, of course, illegal, but the Crown and the police had different standards for the different types of coinage. Counterfeiting silver and gold coinage was equated with treason, and the end result was usually a hangman's noose. Precious metal coins were seen as the bedrock of the British economy, and anything that threatened them could threaten the stability of the crown. Counterfeits of copper coins were a different thing altogether. Because the crown never issued enough copper coin to fill the needs of its own citizens, these counterfeits were tolerated at least to a point. When too many were in circulation and merchants and citizens complained, action would occasionally be taken, but for the most part, the police practiced a relatively hands-off approach. For those that were caught counterfeiting copper coins, the sentence was usually just a year and a day in prison, which would not be pleasant, but certainly not as bad as hanging. In some cases, it appears that the presses and dies used to strike the counterfeits weren't even seized or destroyed by the police. And it's likely that the counterfeiter's family continued the practice, using those funds to pay for the room and board in jail, to get better food, better living quarters, and all of that. The law may have seen copper counterfeits as evil, but it was most definitely a necessary evil. With a decent potential profit and relatively low risk, one can see why counterfeiting was so prevalent at this time. But the time itself was also part of the reason for widespread counterfeiting, as this was, of course, the era of the Industrial Revolution. Small tabletop presses could be made or bought cheaply, the cost of making dies plummeted as the cost of steel dropped, and blank planchets were available in quantity from any of the button makers in Birmingham. Middlemen or jobbers were able to sell or rent these items, none of which were individually illegal to own, and they could sell them across all of England because roads, canals, and transportation links were improving as well at this time. For a very small initial investment, someone could acquire the necessary equipment to literally and figuratively make money. It's likely that there were hundreds or maybe even thousands of small family-run counterfeiting mini-mints in England, probably operating in every county, every major city, and they were either making small quantities of counterfeits for local circulation or working on a cottage industry model, making them for others in larger quantities and getting paid based solely on how many they were able to produce. There were, of course, larger mints as well, which likely had multiple presses going, of better quality that could turn out vast quantities of product. These mints could have easily operated within legitimate businesses of the time, hiding in plain sight. Button makers needed the equipment that were used for counterfeiting. They had a reason for using copper. So did token makers. But any large manufacturer could make or acquire the minimal machinery that was needed. And it's likely that these larger counterfeiting operations, or the cottage industry ones that accumulated totals from smaller minters, were the ones that were being able to sell at discount for quantity. So there are two main types of counterfeits for this era. There are cast ones and struck ones. Cast counterfeits are usually looking something like this. They were the first ones made. They're mainly made in the George II and the very early George III years prior to the Industrial Revolution. Presses weren't available, dies weren't available, but casts were very easy to make. All you needed was good quality sand, some scrap metal, and high heat to melt it. Any blacksmith, silversmith, or foundry could easily do this work. The problem with casts, as you can see on this example here, is they're pretty easy to spot. They're usually somewhat rough from the casting process. They're somewhat brassy in appearance, and they all often have kind of mushy detail. The lettering, the dates aren't as crisp as they would be as if they were struck pieces. They're also very laborious to make. You had to build mold frames. You had to pour the metal once it was heated. You had to allow the frames to cool before breaking them out. You have to file the edge of every single coin to remove the evidence of casting ports. And then you had to clean up the coin a little bit too to get it into circulation. it would be difficult or impossible for any single person to make large quantities of casts in a short period of time. But there was another way, which were struck counterfeits. This one is the same date as the cast, and you could pretty much see the difference in quality here. Struck counterfeits are far better quality. They could be made in quantities of thousands of coins per day by one person, compared to probably a few dozen casts at most. Cast counterfeits of George II coppers are relatively common, while cast counterfeits of George III's are quite rare. And that shift occurs right as the technology became available to allow more people to strike counterfeits instead of casting them. Matthew Boulton, seen here, noted that in his travels around England in the 1770s and 1780s, that over 2/3 of the copper coin he received in change at toll gates or for small purchases was counterfeit. And it appears that figure was not far from the truth. 2/3 of the amount of copper was counterfeit. We're acquainted with Gresham's law that says bad money drives out good, and that's exactly what happened. If you had a well-struck, good weight Regal halfpence, and it was worth the exact same amount in trade as a poorly made, ridiculously underweight counterfeit, which would you spend and which would you save? The more counterfeits that appeared, the less one would see a Regal coin in commerce. So let's talk about how counterfeits came to America. And let's face it, a C4 talk where you can show one picture of Matthew Boulton and one picture of Eddie Murphy, pretty good talk. Notice the counterfeit coin. So we situated that counterfeits were in England and Ireland at the time. Scotland and Wales both used British coins, so they would have been prevalent there as well. But how did these coppers make the journey across the Atlantic to North America? The answer is the same as it was for England: need and profit. The American colonies were purposely kept short of circulating coin. Damaged or mutilated Regal coppers, along with very underweight silver and gold coins that would never be acceptable in England, could come here and trade. And other European coins usually circulated here as well at a higher value than they would have been anywhere else, generally double face value. But there was never a large enough supply of them to grow business, which the mother country was perfectly happy with. England wanted its colonies to supply raw materials, which the British factories would then make into finished goods and sell them back to the colonies at a profit. In the entire colonial period, England only expressly issued 2 copper coinages for all of the American colonies. The first was the lightweight Rosa Americana coinage, which was produced by a private contractor, William Wood. Circulating issues of this were struck only from 1722 to 1723. Some pattern issues were made in 1724. They could have circulated theoretically all across the American colonies because they're not named as one particular colony, but it seems that most of them probably circulated in the northern colonies. The second issue, which you heard a talk about yesterday, was the Virginia halfpenny. Now, these were better made. They were struck at the Royal Mint, better weight, better quality, but they had bad timing. They literally landed in America on the eve of the Revolution, and they saw limited circulation before the war. They may have circulated a little bit more afterwards, but timing was not great. England did periodically send over shipments of Regal British copper coins, including a very large shipment in 1749, where they sent over 1.2 million coins to Boston. These were halfpence and farthings, and the money was sent to reimburse Massachusetts for the expenses they incurred during the French and Indian War. Massachusetts had a lot of paper money, had some silver, but it didn't have much copper at all, so this was really a needed issue. Other copper coins, mainly Irish in origin, also came to the American colonies, including the St. Patrick coppers and the Hibernia coinage. These weren't really much wanted in Ireland at the time, and they were too lightweight to circulate in England at all. But this coinage was still never enough to fill the needs of commerce. Even those 1.2 1749 dated coins amounted to just for one coin for every person in colonial America, or about 6 coins if the shipment stayed completely in Massachusetts, which wasn't likely to happen. The population of early America was constantly growing, and the supply of copper was usually shrinking as some coins went back to England in trade, were lost, or simply got worn down to a point that they would no longer circulate. Once again, counterfeits saved the day with the same problems that they had in England. They were welcomed at first when they were needed, tolerated as a necessary evil for much of their circulation, but occasionally, when there were too many in circulation or the counterfeits got too bad, there were protests and outright bans on them for short periods. But the colonists had less choice than their British or Irish counterparts, and they made do with what they had. I did mention that farthings came over as well, and it appears that farthings were more popular in America during the George II years. The 1749 shipment I mentioned had about 400,000 of them, and there were other shipments made of farthings along with halfpence in the 1730s. But by the 1760s, the farthing is seldom mentioned, and few dated after that period have actually been found in any sort of archaeological context in North America. The farthing was less popular in England and Ireland at the same time as well. And we know this because there were far fewer of them made by the Royal Mint and far fewer made by counterfeiters. The number of dye varieties of counterfeit halfpennies are in the thousands. The number of dye varieties for counterfeit farthings in the hundreds. So the farthing should still be collected by anyone interested in the counterfeit series. They just didn't reach North America in as appreciable of numbers. Not many counterfeits seem to have been made in the American colonies, despite what some earlier writers claimed, with one exception that we'll discuss later. The majority of the pieces made here were likely casts, which required no special equipment, but unfortunately, there's no way to tell where a coin was cast or when. Ground finds that were unearthed in America could have originally been made in England. There were very, very few struck counterfeits that we could pinpoint as probably being made in North America for the simple reason that presses were not available, which meant that England had banned the importation of machinery to the colonies because they didn't want the colonies manufacturing things. So the few coins that were struck here all seem to be extremely crude, struck by hand using a heavy hammer and an anvil. It's a method that could bang out a small number of coins, but not great quantities. These 4 varieties are all thought to have been made here since the few examples known have only been found in North America and were completely unknown in England. The 1770 dated banana nose copper has 2 varieties, each of which has only one example known to exist. The 1771 baby head it's a little more common. It has 10 to 12 varieties existent today. This sad-looking guy is a 1783 dated counterfeit. It's the only counterfeit known of this date. Only 2 are known. Both were found in North America. And this 1771 very crude Irish type has about 10 examples known, all of which have been found in Canada or the United States, though there are similar types known, not from these dyes, but very similar looking types that were found in England and Ireland. Incidentally, if you wanted to buy all 4 of these coins, an offer of $100,000 would not get them, which isn't bad for things that were once shunned as worthless, right? So all of those American-made counterfeits were dated at or before the end of the Revolution. Things changed quickly afterwards, and it was no longer illegal for machinery to be imported into the United States or for people to build their own. Within 2 years of the end of hostilities, Vermont and Connecticut were issuing their own state coinage, and New Jersey and Massachusetts soon followed. We started this talk by mentioning that the state coinage were not the most commonly encountered copper, even in the 1780s when they were made, We have some proof of this with the notorious Machen's Mills coinage seen here. While the Machen's Mint struck counterfeits of all the state coinage designs, their most common production were these imitation British halfpence. Most of these were backdated to years that they knew British coppers were struck, like the 1774 issue here. But others were dated much later, the 1777 and 1788, likely the years that they were actually coined, long after the counterfeit or the regal halfpence had stopped production in England. We have further evidence that counterfeit British and Irish halfpence were common in the colonies in the early United States, for they served as host coins for some of the state coinage. Here's an interesting one that it's a regal halfpenny that was used as a planchet for a New Jersey copper. You can see the date there. Counterfeit Irish halfpenny showing up on a Vermont copper. These issues were likely made in 1788, 1789, when there was enough state coinage in circulation that people preferred those to counterfeit British halfpence and Irish halfpence. And the state coinages had at least some semblance of legal tender value. In 1788, 89, it might have been possible to buy quantities of the counterfeits for little more than their melt value, which made them an easy source of planchets for counterfeiters. From the 1730s through the mid-1780s, the counterfeit British and Irish coppers in early American circulation were mostly imported from England. Casts would have been the first things imported, mainly from the 1730s to the 1770s, and those casts would supplement any that were being made in North America. Walter Breen and other writers often ignored the state of technology when they claimed that struck counterfeits were flooding into America throughout the 18th century. They weren't. Struck counterfeits would have been quite rare through the 1770s, and those that were made in that time and not simply backdated would have been needed more in England and Ireland and not shipped to North America. It's only in the 1780s that struck counterfeits would have arrived in any sort of quantity. One thing worth noting about these counterfeits is that few of them were actually struck in or even near the date they bear. We can see this here. We have a George II dated counterfeit Irish halfpenny obverse that comes with a reverse dated 1696, 30 years before he was king. 1760, which is an accurate date, that was during his reign, although he died late in that year, and 1769, 9 years after he died. There's also a George III reverse that pairs in with the same 1696 reverse, which was 42 years before George III was actually born. So always take a date with a grain of salt in the counterfeit series. There were periodic protests in some of the colonies about counterfeit coins, especially in the 1750s, during the end of George II's reign. By this point, regal coppers had been struck in England for over 25 years. And while that supply was never ample, there would have been enough legitimate copper to kind of meet the needs for circulation in England, which meant it would have been very difficult to pass some of those crude cast counterfeits we saw. But those same casts got a second lease on life when they were sent to the American colonies, which, remember, had had no official coinage sent over since the Rosa Americana pieces, which were themselves very lightweight and not as well made as one would hope. That was 3 decades earlier. So the story of ships coming to America laden with counterfeits labeled as casks of hardware is likely at least partially true, but the ships were bringing cast counterfeits early on. After the Revolution, through the early 1800s, most of the counterfeits coming to America would have been the struck variety. Indeed, the trickle of coins coming over after the end of the Revolution would probably have turned into a flood, just as the American economy was starting to grow dramatically, with new businesses, banks, land ventures, and all of that, unique small denominations to pay daily expenses and wages. This flood of counterfeits, both of the British halfpence and of the state coinages themselves, all of these are counterfeit issues of the states, became so large that they nearly capsized the ship. The Copper's Panic of 1789 occurred when merchants and officials refused to take any copper coin except at a severe discount. And looking at the quality of some of these counterfeits, it's easy to see why. All of these are exceedingly lightweight and quite crudely made, of course. The economy recovered, and it's likely that even more counterfeits poured in from England because the state mints all closed by 1789. While the Philadelphia Mint started issuing coins to the public in 1793, these are not my coins, by the way, thank you Stax Bowers for the images, the amounts were trivial, and half and large cents likely never circulated outside of the major cities of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. It would be another decade before most Americans outside of those major cities would regularly see federal US copper coinage. And in that meantime, the void was again filled with counterfeit British halfpence, plus any of the state coppers that were able to return to circulation. This time frame worked well for British counterfeiters too. The decade from 1787 to 1797 saw the issue of massive amounts of copper tokens, which Americans today call condor tokens. These were the first two types struck. This is a penny token from the island of from Anglesey, and this is a halfpenny of the same type. These popular Drew tokens were struck at the Paris mines, and they were issued in staggering numbers. Thousands of other condor tokens soon followed, usually much lighter weight than these. These contain their full value in copper. But even those lighter tokens were often better than the counterfeits that they soon replaced and drove out of circulation. In 1797, Matthew Boulton began striking his famous cartwheel, tuppence, and penny. And in under 3 years, his steam presses turned out over 1,250 tons of these coppers, British long tons, not short tons, more copper than the British Royal Mint had coined in the entire 18th century combined. With this 1-2 punch, the writing was on the wall for counterfeit coppers in England. Whatever could be exported and sold even at deep discount was, and much of the rest found its way into melting pots. The mass counterfeiting of British and Irish copper coins had come to an end, though occasionally later pieces were counterfeit, usually quite crude and in very small numbers. There's a few examples of them. This one of my absolute favorites. The people who had been making counterfeits were driven out of business by Matthew Boulton and his Soho Mint. And for a couple decades at least, there was finally sufficient copper coin in England. During this same time, the output of the Philadelphia Mint became sufficient for the needs in much of the United States. And while one could occasionally see British halfpence used in transactions, they were still quasi-legal tendered through the 1850s, the numbers would be small and few, if any, new counterfeits would have been imported. This was truly the end of an era. So let's move on to some specifics about collecting these coins today. No surprise, there's been more research and publication done on contemporary counterfeit halfpence and farthings in the last 20 years than in the last 200 years combined. This is obvious to any reader of the Colonial newsletter, the C4 newsletter, the Journal of Early American Numismatics, each of which has featured numerous articles on counterfeits in recent years. But the entire series is a bit daunting in terms of size, and we know that these coins were likely saved or collected at some time because an awful lot of them survive to this day, often in quite nice condition. They would have been inexpensive things to collect, and one could acquire a lot of different types of them with little effort. No different, perhaps, than collecting Connecticut coppers would have been in the mid-19th century. Just as in that series, collectors started noticing similarities and differences between coins and began to put them into some sort of order. This was easy to do with Connecticut coppers, for instance, since there were only 4 dates. couple dozen major types, and the main differences between most of the dies were the punctuation and ornamentation used in the legends. Once those differences were noted, they could be put into an order that made sense, which is essentially what Sylvester Crosby did in 1875. Collectors could then go deeper and try to find as many die varieties as possible within various legend types, which is what Dr. Thomas Hall and Henry Miller did in their books. This was a fairly easy task because the number of styles was relatively small. Bust left, bust right, bust wearing armor, bust wearing drapery, little things like that. And looking at those types, one could see obvious similarities between some of them, suggesting that they were made at the same mint. Others were different enough in style that they were easily seen as something different, perhaps even contemporary counterfeits made at an unauthorized mint. The process is a little more difficult for contemporary counterfeits, though, which is why it was 200 years before any real work was done to try and organize them. Instead of just dealing with a couple of mints and a couple of styles, we were, as said, dealing with hundreds of mints, perhaps thousands across England, Ireland, probably Scotland and Wales as well, producing an amazing number of different varieties using thousands of different dyes. A logistical nightmare, to say the least. Work started slowly, bringing together pieces that shared markedly similar styles. The simian type seen here was the easiest group to spot. At first it was thought these were made in America because of their crudeness, but that was quickly disproved, though their style has certainly charmed collectors today. Other groups were found that were also tied together, and these groups are called families today. We've found over 70 different ones so far, with far more yet to be found. Some families are small, they consist of just 2 to 6 varieties. Others are large and contain dozens of varieties. The simians probably contain hundreds of different die varieties because they were coined George II, George III, British, Irish, halfpence, farthings. There's even a William III simian counterfeit known. So while describing these various families is too complex for the short amount of time we have left, suffice to say that families can be linked by just 3 different factors. The strongest link is die sharing. If one obverse die was paired with 2 reverse dies, then all 3 of those dies were likely used at the same mint around the same time. If one of those reverses is used with 5 other obverses, then all of those are added into the family. You extend the family as possible. The next way to link die or link a family together is punch linkage, which isn't as strong as die linkage because we don't know if punches traveled from mint to mint, if there were traveling die engravers, but it is still something that's useful. You just want to take it with some caution because, as we know, there are only so many ways to draw the letter R or the number 7, and the same thing is true for punches. But it's useful. Here's a counterfeit. This is called the Topless Ordinal family, and you can see up here that the tops of the ordinals and the top of the letter I isn't there. The punch was broken in this area. There are a number of dies that use these exact same punches, and it's easy to put them together into a family based on this one characteristic. Once you get them together, you start noticing similarities in the style of the bust, the engraving of the seated Britannia figure. Some have very similar branches in the hand. Some are different as well, but this is how you link them together. Coins with this diagnostic are pretty easy to spot, and generally the diagnostic will be in the name of the family. The third way to form a family is by design similarity, which is the weakest of the ways because it's always hard to say that there's definitive proof that the same design was only used by this one engraver or this one mint. But with a group like the simians that we just saw, the similarity is so strong that it's impossible to conclude otherwise. So after individual families were identified, more specialized work would be done. Individual die varieties within families were numbered, published, and illustrated, and this has resulted in many articles and the first reference work to deal with individual dye varieties. This was published by C4 in 2018. This book covers the family concept in far more depth than here, so please get the book and read it. Over 30 families are illustrated with all known dye varieties at the time of publication. But because of the sheer size of the field, there was no way that all families could be done in a single book. And this is hopefully the first of many volumes that will cover the entire series. To put the size of the Counterfeit series in perspective, just a little fun game. If you took every variety of Connecticut copper, New Jersey copper, Massachusetts copper, and Vermont copper and added them together, you have around 600 dye varieties. Toss in all the Fugios, all the Virginia halfpennies, all the Rosa Americanas, all the Massachusetts silver, all the plantation tokens, all the Higleys, all the colonial era Washington coins, all the post-Confederation tokens, and you have about 1,000 individual dye varieties. Multiply that number by 10 and you have a conservative estimate of the number of individual dye varieties found in the British and Irish halfpence and farthing series. The number might actually be closer to double that. So collecting a series like this certainly needs all the skills you've already mastered with colonials. One key skill that you need is to tell the difference between a regal coin and a counterfeit. Some pieces make this quite easy. If it was struck from crudely engraved dies on a thin planchet, it's always going to be a counterfeit. But there are regal dies that are somewhat sloppily made, and a few that even come with errors in the legend. Notice this one is missing the G in Georgiavis. This is a Royal Mint issue, not a counterfeit. There are also counterfeits from well-made dies that are struck on planchets very close or even equal to the weight of regal coins, because again, they would still be making a profit, just not a huge one. As with any series, the best advice is to study the literature and start off with inexpensive purchases to gain some hands-on experience. The simians are a great way to do this because they're very obvious counterfeits and not ever going to be mistaken for a regal issue. Another obvious counterfeit type is a mule. This one has a bust of George II, but a date in the George III reign. These come the other way around. There are also country mules where one side is British and one side is Irish. Obviously, the Royal Mint would never have made coins like this, so they're known to be counterfeits very easily. Another easy counterfeit to spot are things with non-regal dates where the Royal Mint did not strike coins. The British halfpenny coinage stopped in 1775. Here's one dated 1794. Clearly not going to be a real coin. So the counterfeit series also has a large number of error strikes available for significantly less money than these would bring as colonials. And these kind of add some eye-popping coins to your collection. Here you have a triple struck with 3 dates, a simian brockage, a almost purposely made flip over double strike with the king wearing a crown, major off center, all sorts of fun things. So along with the counterfeits, I actually recommend that collectors purchase a few circulated examples of regal British and Irish coppers for George II and George III. These can be found for $10 or less a piece. They're invaluable to have as control specimens. If you want to decide if a coin is counterfeit or not, you lay it on top of a known regal. Because the counterfeits were not made from the same, on the same planchets that the Royal Mint used, they're going to be a different size, different thickness, different diameter, and you can see this much, much easier this way. This method has really been useful to tell counterfeits from regals when the counterfeits were worn or corroded or had some damage. They often looked counterfeit, but they proved to be regal instead. As with any series, your knowledge grows with experience, and the more counterfeits you see, the better you get at identifying them. And attributing them can be tough at the beginning, but so was attributing Connecticut's, Fugios, or Massachusetts coppers, and we all learned how to do that. While the book is pretty easy to use, there are families not yet published and more waiting to be discovered. There are also varieties that don't link to any other one, at least so far. Some of them might find families, some may stay orphaned forever. And all of this makes the Counterfeit series an exciting one to research and collect. Finding a new variety of Vermont or Fujio copper may be a once-in-a-lifetime event if there are any left to discover. Finding an unlisted New Jersey copper might happen once every couple decades, and a new Connecticut might turn up once a decade, though both of those series are probably nearing the end of that happening. But for counterfeits, unlisted varieties are not only probable for many families, they're guaranteed. So a question usually asked is, how much is this worth? Just like colonial coins, the answer is always going to be, that depends. Factors like grade, variety, type, and collector interest all come into play. A circulated example from a common family may be worth $10, while better condition coins may be worth a few $100s. Truly uncirculated examples are rare, and these have sold for hundreds of dollars, occasionally up into the $1,000 range. Unusual types will usually bring somewhere in the mid-hundreds, while especially rare families and dates are impossible to find for under 4 figures. The rarest of the rare, like the American counterfeits we saw earlier, might sell into the high 4, even into the low 5-figure range. Here are some of the more expensive types. These are the Rubber Lady family, so named because she doesn't seem to have bones in her legs or her arms. A rather famous counterfeit with the legends and devices engraved in backwards, mostly, and a 1785 date, which is quite rare. These would all sell in the thousands of dollars a piece. This is across the board far less than what colonial coins of equal rarity would cost. The unique WM New Jersey copper is coming up for auctions relatively soon. It might bring $500,000 when it's next auction, while a unique family or a unique Rubber Lady die variety brought a couple $1,000s when it sold recently in the Eric Newman collection. Counterfeits that may end up in the R7 range can be found for a few $100s today, 10% or less of what a comparable Connecticut copper would bring, and an even smaller fraction of what it would bring if it was a Vermont, Mass, Fujio, Jersey copper. The reason for this comes down to supply and demand. The Colonial series has more collectors competing for a smaller number of varieties. Colonials also have the benefit of far more accrued knowledge, with dozens of books, thousands of articles, and tens of thousands of auction catalog descriptions, which could be mined for rarity and value information, plus tidbits that are found in many of these descriptions. Counterfeits, on the other hand, are just at the beginning of that journey. To again compare them with colonial coins, the knowledge for counterfeits today is about where colonials were in the 1870s to 1880s. That's not a bad place for the collector to be. It means that there are discoveries to be made, research to be done, and substantial opportunities for cherry picking, all at a much lower cost than they will be after more books are published and new collectors enter the field. How deep you want to go into collecting contemporary counterfeits is completely up to you. Pursuing the thousands of die varieties, trying to get one of everything could add decades of fun to your collecting life. But collecting just a couple families or going only after the crudely made pieces or non-regal dates or casts or mules or whatever else tickles your fancy can still get you a meaningful and enjoyable collection over the course of many years. Regardless of how you choose to collect them, every collector of colonial coins should own at least a couple of them. Throughout most of the 18th century, the counterfeit British halfpence allowed the lower and middle classes to survive on both sides of the Atlantic. These coins formed the backbone of the American economy and would have been used by nearly all merchants and businesses. They served as the template for some of the American state coinages, as the designs of the Connecticut and bust-style Vermont coppers directly imitated the image of a male bust on one side and a seated female figure on the other. Their sheer quantity nearly brought down the American experiment in the Copper's Panic of 1789, but then they were forgotten for nearly 2 centuries, their role discounted or completely ignored. It was only in the 20th century that collectors started to pay attention to these pieces, though some British writers still refer to them as nothing more than album weeds. But remember, it's far more likely that George Washington handled counterfeit British halfpence than ever handling Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts, Fugio, or New Jersey copper. And I cannot tell a lie either. This is the end of the talk, so let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Okay, if you can go ahead, and you got it. You beat me to it. Okay, we do have a couple questions in the text Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and read one of those. And then if anyone in the audience would like to ask a question live, at the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says raise hand. If you click on that, then after this first question, I will allow you to speak so you can talk with Jeff live. So that's how we're going to work that. In the meantime, we have a question from Ed. So legitimate copper issues weren't the majority in circulation. Do we have any actual idea of what kind of percentage of circulating copper was counterfeit?
I don't know if there's any published references in colonial America. The Matthew Bolton estimate of 2/3 in England is probably pretty similar to what it would have been here as well. Understanding that we would probably get lesser quality things sent over. So I've not seen any actual published reports.
Okay, then we have a question in the Q&A from Bill. What was the most common counterfeit coin or coins in colonial America?
Well, I mean, the counterfeit British halfpenny would have been the most prevalent here, just because there were so many of them made. There were so many of them in England, they would have been here as well. Irish probably less so, though we do tend to see more Irish used as planchets or as host coins for overstruck state coppers, more Irish than British. But the Irish would have been lighter weight, so there would have been more profit potential there, and that may just be the reason why.
Okay. Let's see, we have a question from Ray. Do any counterfeit dies exist that were confiscated by authorities when capturing counterfeiters?
There in the Old Bailey records, there are some accounts of where they seized dies. I don't know of any that actually exist today. There is a casting mold that does exist that changed hands recently. It's a little bit problematic because it doesn't look like what one would expect a copper casting mold to look like. So, it may have been a later creation or something. But it's usually unlikely that dies remain in existence for long anyway, because there were steel that would rust, and once that coinage was done, there would be no use for the dies. And for a counterfeit, you really don't want evidence around. So not surprising. We have no dies from the state copper series either, and those you would expect that perhaps the minters would keep one as a memento of their experience, but since most of them went bankrupt, maybe not.
Okay, then we do have a couple hands up in the audience. So Roger Moore, you should be able to turn on your microphone in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. There you go.
Hey, Jeff, thanks for a really great talk. I just wanted to ask a question that's been confusing to me, and that is that we know that a lot of the counterfeiters in Britain were undesirable, unscrupulous people. And the British loved to send these unscrupulous people over to the America to get rid of them out of England. Is there any reason to believe that many of these unscrupulous people did not, especially the counterfeiters, did not start their own counterfeiting operations? I think there's some evidence from the I-95 fines that you've read the paper, so you know the situation, that probably there was. I mean, you gave some great examples of known counterfeits that were made in America, but I think there are probably a far more number of them than simply the ones that you had pointed out. And I just get your view on that.
That may be true. There's nothing in the Old Bailey records of any counterfeiter getting transport. There is some record of that later on for counterfeiting paper money, but they were sent to Australia, not to North America. Because the counterfeiting of copper was a relative, I mean, it was technically a felony, but not really. It was never treated as one. And I don't think the officials would have ever forced somebody to leave, especially as, as I said, it was a necessary tolerated evil. Some may have certainly come over on their own and plied their trade here. Yeah, the baby head that we saw was likely made by a British military person, which Gary Trudgeon went into great detail in the Colonial newsletter. For casts, though, I mean, anybody could make a cast. Any blacksmith, any silversmith, any household that had a source for high heat could even make them themselves. So it's an interesting question, but I've not seen it in the legal documents so far. So might be worth searching for, though.
Yeah, we do know that there was a firm over in New Jersey in the early 1700s where they arrested a number of people for counterfeiting at an ironworks, making counterfeit coins. But I think the documentation is not great. So I think that we need
And that is the problem, is most of the time the documents, even in the court cases, is very limited. And the judicial system didn't have the terminology. So, making counterfeits might just be, might mean making casts or operating a press with, striking thousands of them. And they don't really differentiate usually. They don't seem to know the difference between molds and dyes, for instance. They'll use the same words interchangeably. They'll say struck when maybe they meant cast. So it is interesting. It's an interesting idea worth pursuing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Alrighty. Then let's see. We do have a couple more hands up. We only have a few more minutes. There was one question in the Q&A I wanted to be sure to answer. It says, I got in late. Will this excellent talk and the other C4 talks be published on the NNP possibly? I know they will be up on the C4 website. I'm not sure if they'll be up on the NNP as well, but that should be shared in a communication from the club as a whole after the convention. So they will for sure be on the C4 website. Should be within 2 weeks, if not sooner. So yes, that was that answer. Okay, let's see. Then we have Paul Cartmill. Okay, Paul, you should be able to unmute yourself. There's a little microphone in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Jeff, I like the slide you put up with the American-made counterfeits, with the banana nose and the baby head. And I immediately started thinking about blacksmiths. Like the baby head specifically reminded me of what have I got here? Like the wood 7. And it made me start looking at most all of the blacksmiths. They're all copies of the sort of the George II. So being a Canadian, those are the kind of counterfeits. I know they came after Mr. Bolton and all that kind of stuff, but I was just wondering if you sort of think, I'm sort of thinking out loud, but after the revolution, the treasonous Brits, or the as we in Canada call them, United Empire Loyalists, maybe those counterfeiters migrated. They still had that George II kind of idea in their head, when they came up with the blacksmith for counterfeiting.
That's an interesting possibility. They're two similar but different series. The Canadian blacksmith tokens, for those of you who don't really know the series well, was likely made in the 1830s, possibly a little bit earlier, but not a whole lot earlier. And they certainly do imitate British coinage, and they're far more crude than most of the counterfeit coppers of the era. Much thinner, usually kind of brassy looking as well. And I think that they just counterfeited what was still in circulation at the time. So there may have been more George II's, but the lack of engraving skill, don't even know if they were intending to be George II or George III, and they just cut them into the die backwards. Some of the blacksmiths, the seated figures facing the other way than it would be on a British copper. So it might just be that they intended to make a George III, just cut it in, instead of cutting it into the die backwards, cut it into the die exactly as it looked, which would have made it, the piece face the other direction. But it is interesting. We know less about Canada at the time than we do about North America. So it's a wide open field.
Just had to put a plug in for Canada there.
Good to hear you, Paul.
Alrighty, and we did get a comment in the Q&A from Jack saying that the talks will be linked to the Newman portal. So
good.
There's more information on it. Okay, we have one more text question and then one more hand raised, and we have approximately 4 minutes before I have to get the next talk going. So we're going to
spend through at the end, hoping we get some questions. So.
Okay, we got a question from Randy C. Mike Ringo was working on linkages between Connecticut bung towns and counterfeit halfpence families. Has there been more work done in this area?
Mike was working in an era that had, what's a nice way to say it, less strict standards or less ability to do the research. I don't think what he was doing then stands the test of time now. And if he were still here, he would be the first to admit that. He saw similarities. Like I said, there's only so many ways you can draw a 7, right? Just because 2 people draw it the same way doesn't mean it's the same punch that was used. I would like to see more work done on that. I'm working on an article that does use the Connecticut bungtown tokens and compares them to a British counterfeit family. There are some similarities in technique and manufacture, but I don't think there were the same people making them. And like I said, I think Mike would agree if he were here today.
Okay, we have one last question from Bob Metzger. And Bob, we got 3 minutes, so we got to get through this quickly, but I wanted to be sure everyone got to ask.
Go, Bob.
On the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you should have a microphone. There you go.
I am unmuted. Hey, Jeff. I think it's a pretty quick question. I don't see many counterfeit Irish farthings. So what's the deal?
Well, there were a few regal Irish farthings struck. Ireland didn't really like the denomination, it seems, especially that late. The very small St. Patrick issues were used there. We don't know if those were farthings or half pennies or what the case was, but they really only had, it was the 1744 and 1760, and I think one other issue off the top of my head. So because there were so few in circulation, it's not surprising that there would be so few counterfeits of them made. And the counterfeits of the Irish farthings tend to be casts. I don't. Yep. I think I've only seen one that I thought was a struck counterfeit. So just limited circulation, limited acceptance, maybe, and the counterfeiters were copying what was in circulation, what they thought they could get past. And if they didn't see a lot of those, they probably didn't do it. Just to add in, the one type of coin that there is not a Simeon family counterfeit of is Irish farthing so far. To me, that just means they weren't around because they counterfeited everything else.
Well, exactly. And that's why I brought it up. And as much as anything, just for the record,
There you go.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Alrighty, thank you. Okay, so that is going to wrap us up. Thank you everyone for watching. If you want to join us for John Kraljevich's talk, it'll be starting at 8:45. It should be open to join in about 5 minutes or so. So thank you again, Jeff. That was a very interesting talk on a topic that I know is very broad with a lot of research still to be done. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for running everything so wonderfully.
I'm glad it's going well so far.
Fingers crossed, Friday the 13th.
Going strong. Okay, hope to see you all at John Kraljevich's talk up next.